Welcome to another edition of the Law and Gospel Devotional. My name is Eric Sorensen, and each week we gather to look with you at God's two words, both His Word of Law, which tells us everything that we ought to do and points out the many ways in which we fall short, and most importantly, His Word of Gospel, which ultimately tells us all that God has done for us and our salvation through Jesus Christ our Lord, in spite of the fact that we have disobeyed His law. Well, good to be here with you again after a week away where I was traveling for work. I'm back, and so when I'm back in town, I like to make these videos so that we can spend a little time digging into God's Word. Today, we're looking at the Gospel passage for this Sunday's series of lectionary texts. It's one of Jesus' parables, and if you know anything about me based on the book right behind me here, you know that I'm quite a fan of the parables. I co-wrote a book with Dan Price, my co-host on 30 Minutes in the New Testament, all about the parables of Jesus, although I did not write on this particular parable. This parable was left out by me, and so I'm happy to go over it with you today. Which parable are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the parable of the talents found in Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, which really is all about the burden and the privilege of being gifted. Yes, indeed, it is a topic that is worthy of our attention because everybody, one way or another, is gifted. Before we dive in, let's go ahead and just read the parable. Let's read it from start to finish, and then we'll chop it up a little bit and talk about this burden and privilege of being gifted. So the passage says, verse 14, "For it will be like a man going on a journey." He's talking about the kingdom of God here. He says, "It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 5 talents here. I have made 5 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours.' But his master answered him, 'You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Well, that's quite the parable. What are we to make of it? Well, first of all, what we're to make of it is a very central fact to the Scriptures, and that is this. No matter who you are, no matter what background you have, no matter what talents you may or may not think you have, you are gifted. Christian, you have gifts. Yes, probably more than one gift. The parable depicts for us what will happen at the judgment, and it's abundantly clear that everyone who comes before the master has received a gift from the master. Now, I know that seems very obvious, but it's important to note that right up front. And what do we know about gifting? Well, some gifts come kind of natural to people. You just have maybe a natural athletic ability or a natural sense of rhythm. There's natural gifts, but they still need to be nurtured. I talk about this with my children all the time, especially my younger ones, that you only really become good at something, even if you're naturally gifted for it, by working on it and by practicing. They don't always like hearing this from their old man, but nevertheless, we know that's true. But there are certain things that we just naturally kind of come by. Fair enough. But also, of course, some gifts come primarily through training and learning, and yet they're no less gifts. But the point of gifts and having gifts is that they're all meant to be used for the good of our neighbors. I can't help but think of the example of the world-renowned chess player Bobby Fischer. For many years, Bobby Fischer could basically beat anyone at chess. He was an absolute savant at the game of chess. And even when he was a child, I think by the time he was 12 years old, he was world champion. He was chess master. It's just crazy, the intellect on this guy. Absolutely naturally gifted for chess. And yet, if you know the story of Bobby Fischer, you know it's a tragic one, because eventually he stopped using his gift to play chess and became a bit of a hermit, actually quite a lot of a hermit, and really never picked up the game again. He lost his ability to use his gift because he got tired of having the gift for various reasons. He had many mental challenges along the way. So all that to be said, we all have gifts. It doesn't mean that we all use our gifts. And this is what I want to focus on, because the main character really in this parable, besides the master who gives the talents away, is this one particular person who, upon receiving one talent, instead of using it, goes and hides it. Why is that? Why might it be the case that we could find ourselves a little fearful of using our gifts, or for that matter, being hesitant to use our gifts? Well, I think maybe sometimes it's because we don't really believe we are gifted. Now, intellectually, Christians know God's gifts come to his people, that God gifts all his people. We know this. But we can make two mistakes in the way that we think about God's gifts. And that is, number one, we have too narrow of a view of what it means to be gifted. And I see this in the church pretty regularly. Basically, people associate spiritual gifts with basically being a pastor, a church worker, or, well, nothing else. And so if you're not doing something in the church, then it must mean that you're not spiritually gifted. That is false. That is not true. You know that the Apostle Paul lists hospitality as one of the gifts, and he tells us to foster that in our lives. Now, hospitality, opening your home to people, doesn't necessarily seem spiritual at first blush, but of course it's very spiritual to create a space for fellowship. But then there's a second mistake that people make when it comes to gifting, and that is people are often discouraged from using their gifts. They've been made to feel that there's no place for their gifts, especially within the church, and so they might be prone to burying it or not using it or hiding it because they just don't know where they can actually use the gifts. But of course, the Apostle Paul refutes that in his famous passage in 1 Corinthians 12, where he talks about the fact that every member of the body, yes, is different, but is also united as part of Christ's body and therefore gifted by Christ. He says this, "For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body." Yes, just to reiterate again, you are gifted. No matter what you've been told, no matter what you've heard, you have been gifted by God in some area or another, and that gift can be fostered, again, for the good of your neighbor. It's meant to be used, not to be hidden away. It's just a fact that a lot of the time we are gifted and we don't know it. We have unrecognized gifts. I can't help but think about this short paragraph from a writer named Irving Wallace, who points this out about a number of people that we would recognize today as being extremely gifted. He writes, quote, "Winston Churchill seemed so dull as a youth that his father thought he might be incapable of earning a living in England. Charles Darwin did so poorly in school that his father once told him, 'You will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family.'" By the way, side note, sometimes when you read the way that parents talk to children back then, it's kind of incredible how harsh they can be. And this is more normal than you might think. Maybe we're too soft today, I don't know, but I don't want to be that harsh either. Anyway, continuing on, he says, G.K. Chesterton, the English writer, could not read until he was 8. One of his teachers told him, "If we could open your head, we should not find any brain, but only a lump of white fat." Good night, nurse. Man, could have said that a little nicey, a little more nicely. Thomas Edison's first teacher described him as addled, and his father almost convinced him he was a dunce. Albert Einstein's parents feared their child was dull, and he performed so badly in all high school courses except mathematics that a teacher asked him to drop out. All this to say, folks, it's possible that you are gifted. Indeed, you are gifted, and you just don't know it, or you haven't been allowed to really dive into those gifts. And so we want to acknowledge that sometimes what causes people to not use their gifts is this sense that, well, they're just not really all that gifted, and it's not true. But then there's a second reason that people may be hesitant to use their gifts, and that is they feel like they're lacking. In other words, they find themselves comparing their giftedness to others. They see that they're not the best at whatever the thing is, and therefore they hide it away. They don't use what they have because they're not as good as this person or that person. This kind of thing happens all the time, folks. We ask ourselves, what if I'm no good? Of the three servants who are called to account by the master, again, the last one seems afraid that he wouldn't be any good with his talents, so he just hides it. And of course, the Bible would say that's nonsense. Everyone is given a different measure of gifting. That's the way the Bible speaks about it. And what the master is looking for is not the same level of productivity or the same level of greatness. Rather, he's simply looking for it to be used. That's all. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be the best. Now, I don't know if many of you know this, but I'm also a drummer. So besides doing this stuff, when I get a chance, I like to go play the drums. I've played in various bands for, goodness, I'm 20 plus years, 25 years. Man, oh, Shevitz, I am dating myself. And I can keep a beat. I don't know, I'm not terrible. But there were times where I would be very tempted to give up playing drums. And those times happened most specifically any time that someone would turn on the band Rush, and I would be forced to listen to Neil Peart play drums. Because Neil Peart is an insanely good drummer. I mean, just incredibly gifted. Well, he's gone now. But just an incredibly gifted drummer. I mean, any drummer who's worth their salt will tell you that he was really a master of the craft. And it's easy if you hear somebody that's just that good to say, all right, I'm done. I'm giving up. I don't have any business being behind the kit. But of course, you don't need to be Neil Peart to play in a worship band. You don't need to be Neil Peart to play in 99% of bands. You need to be Neil Peart if you're playing in a prog rock band from the 70s named Rush. But you don't need to be Neil Peart to do most of drumming, and you can still actually serve your neighbor by playing drums much simpler than Neil Peart ever did. So the point is, we use our gifts as much as we have gifts, as to the measure that we've been granted, we use it to serve our neighbor. In other words, what I want is you to be more like Anthony Samaras. He's affectionately known as Joe the Barber. And yet, Joe the Barber did not have a barber's license. Nevertheless, this is true. You can find news clippings about this. He used his gift to cut hair for 25 years at a park in Hartford, Connecticut. And his clients were exclusively homeless, and he didn't charge a thing. All he would charge was them giving him a hug after he finished cutting their hair. Now, if Anthony, affectionately known Uncle Joe, or Joe the Barber, if Joe the Barber had said to himself, well, I'm just not cut out for this because I don't have licensure, I'm certainly not the best barber in the world, I might as well not do this, then he would have caused hundreds, if not thousands of people, well, basically not to receive gifts, not to receive a gift from him. He did something kind for them. He did something caring for them. And even if he wasn't the best, he used his gift to the best of his ability and ended up being very beloved by all around him. So the point is, again, God's not looking for you to be the best. He's looking for you to use what you got. As the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do it all to the glory of God. Just try to do the best you can, not for your salvation. It has nothing to do with whether you're saved or not. That's all been wrapped up and taken care of by Jesus, of course, which we'll talk about that more in just a little bit, because after all, this is the law and gospel devotional. But the point is, you do the best you can because your neighbor benefits from you doing the best you can and trying to use your gifts to serve them. And then I think the last reason, and maybe the ultimate reason that people are hesitant to use their gifts, is because really when it comes down to it, They're afraid of being judged. I cannot overstate how much this dominates the interior life of the average human being. The average human being is so afraid that people are looking at them and looking down on them and making fun of them or thinking less of them. We so fear being judged. We shouldn't pass over the man's explanation of why he hid his talent, his gift away, because I think this is the real heart of the matter. And that is, it's because his view of his master was that the master was a hard or harsh man. In his view, the master is only someone to fear, and so we're told that he is afraid of his master. All this to say, the main reason that you will thrive in the use of your gifts, or that you'll be tempted to hide away your gifts, is ultimately based on who we think God is and how we relate to him. How does God see us? I don't know if you saw the movie Shine that came out some years ago, but it's about a pianist, a prodigy of sorts named David Helfgott, who at a very young age became a very famous pianist, renowned all over the world, playing in major concert halls all over the world. And yet, if you know the story, you know that David Helfgott had a major mental break. And the reason he had a mental break in so many ways goes back to his over-domineering father. No matter what David accomplished on the piano, his father was never pleased. His father was always pushing him to do more and to try harder, that he was never really good enough, and he never had the approving gaze of his father look down upon him, and eventually this broke him. Now, the good news in that story is David Helfgott recovered and ended up playing piano again. I think he still plays piano today. I'm not certain about that. But it just goes to show that even if you're really gifted, if you feel that you are not approved by your true and better father, then you're always going to be hesitant to use the gifts you've got. And that's indeed what happened with Helfgott for many years before he was able to see the beauty of the gift that he had eventually. So what happens? The result of seeing God as a harsh taskmaster rather than a giving and gracious father is, well, you get what you wished for. Because God sees this person unwilling to use their talent. And it's not really, I truly don't believe that the condemnation that comes in our passage is because he didn't use the talent. I think the reason that this person is ultimately condemned in this story is because of their refusal to see God for who he really is. They cannot accept a God of grace and mercy and approval. They cannot accept a God that will forgive their sins and love them in spite of their failures no matter what. And so, in the end, they can't see God for who he is. They can only see him with eyes of fear and shame. And so his master answered him, "You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." You see, the master is insulted because this person believes lies about the master and insists on continuing to believe the lies about the master. And so the master says, "Fine, have it your way." But here's the good news for us. In the end, we need to remember that your God does not view you like that. How do I know this? Because I look to Christ. The reality is, though we have not used our talents as we should, there is one who has. Because he was the good and faithful servant, Jesus has shown us that us bad and unfaithful servants can be forgiven of all our sins and declared righteous before the throne of God. Therefore, in the Master's sight, we are seen as good and faithful in everything we do. Let me say that again. On account of Jesus Christ, in the Master's sight, we are seen as good and faithful in everything we do. And it's only when we learn to see God in this way, not as harsh and fearful, but loving and forgiving as a father, that we are truly freed up to use our gifts to their capacity with reckless abandon, because we know that our standing with God isn't dependent on our performance, but dependent on the performance of Jesus Christ. Yes, it's true. The good news is that knowing God's love for you and approval of you isn't going to be determined by your performance for Jesus, but Jesus' performance for you will actually make you perform more and better, not less and worse. In other words, very, very important, grace mobilizes performance. Performance does not mobilize grace, and this is the key. This is the key. The other two servants saw the gifts that they were given as something to be used for good. But they didn't do it out of fear because the master was a harsh taskmaster. No, they did it from freedom. They brought forward what was done, and the master was pleased that they put forward some effort on behalf of their neighbor. But ultimately, what he really wants is for us to see him as a loving and approving Father who does say to us and will say to us on account of Jesus Christ alone, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." Well, I hope that's an encouragement to you folks. I pray God's richest blessings upon you this week. I'm not sure that I'll be able to make a video next week, as I will be in Grand Rapids, Michigan for a church workers conference and then be celebrating Thanksgiving with my family, but I think I will be back the next week. So until then, God's richest blessings to you. We will see you then.